The ambulance's siren screamed down the road, but it wasn't going anywhere. Because of a silver Lexus parked sideways across the only entrance to my neighborhood. I was on a stretcher in the back, the paramedic's voice sharp in my ear. "We're blocked. Dispatch, we've got a vehicle obstructing access. Patient's vitals unstable. We need a reroute now." My vision blurred from the pain in my chest, but even through the haze, I knew exactly who that Lexus belonged to. Sandra Applegate, HOA president, queen of petty power trips. And in that moment, I knew when I got out of this hospital, I was going to burn her little kingdom to the ground. Let me back up. I'm Adrian Runnels, ER nurse, 41. Been working 12-hour night shifts at St. Mark's Hospital for the past 6 years. I bought my house in Maple Hollow 5 years ago, mostly for the peace and the yard space. I didn't ask for an HOA, but it came with the zip code. Sandra was already president when I moved in. Mid-50s, always in a neon blazer with a clipboard glued to her hand like it was her holy text. She ran the HOA like it was a military operation. Fines for leaving your garbage bin out past pickup. Threat letters for unauthorized pumpkins on Halloween. Last year, she tried to write up my neighbor Frank for excessive wind chime noise. We tolerated her. Barely. But this? Blocking emergency responders? That was war. It started 3 days before the ambulance mess. I'd worked a double shift and gotten home around 9 in the morning. I parked in my driveway, dragged myself inside, and passed out on the couch. I woke up to the sound of someone leaning on my doorbell like they were trying to break it. I opened the door to find Sandra, arms crossed, lips pursed like she'd tasted a lemon dipped in battery acid. "You can't park in your driveway like that," she snapped. I blinked, still foggy. "What? You parked over the sidewalk. That's an HOA violation." I stepped outside. My bumper barely nudged over the cracked concrete strip that passed for a sidewalk. "You're kidding. It's a safety hazard. Children walk here. There are no kids on this block." "There might be." I was too tired to argue. I waved her off and shut the door. The next day, a violation notice was taped to my garage, $150 fine. For obstructing a pedestrian path. I laughed, took it down, and tossed it. I'd seen her do worse. But then came the chest pain. It hit me just before dawn the next day. A stabbing pressure in the center of my chest and a cold sweat that told me not to mess around. I managed to call 911 before I collapsed onto the floor. The next thing I remember clearly was the paramedic yelling about a blocked road. And the siren stopping. And that damned Lexus. I found out the full story later, in the cardiac wing, hooked up to machines and pissed off beyond reason. Sandra had been inspecting fences that morning. One of the residents on the other side of the cul-de-sac had painted theirs a slightly different shade of beige. Sandra parked her car sideways across the entrance on purpose so no one could get in until she finished her inspection. The ambulance couldn't get through. They had to back out, reroute through the back service road, and lost 7 minutes. 7 minutes when I was actively having a heart attack. The hospital security team got involved when the EMTs filed a formal complaint. They pulled the security footage from the ambulance dash cam and caught Sandra on camera, arms waving, refusing to move her car. She didn't just ignore the siren. She stood in the middle of the road and yelled that no one is above HOA regulations. That included an ambulance. The security captain, a no-nonsense guy named Lewis, reviewed the tape and shook his head. She blocked a medical emergency. That's obstruction. We're reporting this directly to law enforcement. Sandra thought she was untouchable. She wasn't. Lewis handed the dashcam footage to the city police. But that wasn't all, they also submitted it to the DMV. Turns out, the hospital has a standing agreement with the city for emergency obstruction cases, especially when they endanger patients. Sandra's license was suspended pending investigation. Then came the fines. Not from the HOA, from the city. A total of $15,000 in public safety violations. Each minute of delay was a separate count. When they showed up at her door with the paperwork, I heard she screamed loud enough to set off someone's car alarm. But this wasn't over, because Sandra, in all her delusion, decided to double down. She called an emergency HOA meeting from her living room and tried to pass a motion stating that emergency vehicles must coordinate with HOA leadership before entering the community. That's when the rest of the neighborhood finally snapped. I was still in recovery when my neighbor Frank visited. "You missed the fireworks," he said, grinning. She tried to make it sound like she was protecting the community from unauthorized vehicles. Half the room got up and walked out. I raised an eyebrow. And the other half? Voted to suspend her until further notice. Apparently, the bylaws allowed for a vote of no confidence if enough homeowners signed a petition. Frank had already started one, and people were eager to sign. But Sandra wasn't done yet. She still had access to HOA funds, and she was planning to use them. That's when I decided to stop waiting for karma and start collecting receipts. I knew how to read policy. I'd worked in hospitals long enough to know how to navigate bureaucracy. And I had time thanks to the mandatory medical leave I was stuck on for the next 2 weeks. I started digging. And what I found? It was even worse than I thought. By the time I was discharged, Sandra's name was already circulating on local forums. Someone had posted a clip of the ambulance footage, blurred out faces, but her screeching voice was unmistakable, especially when she barked, "This is private property," at the paramedics. It had been taken from the hospital's legal submission to the city, and the post was titled, "When HOA Power Trips Go Too Far." The comment section was a goldmine. Residents from other neighborhoods chimed in with their own HOA horror stories. But Maple Hollow was now the poster child for what happens when unqualified people are handed unchecked power. Sandra, of course, wasn't going down quietly. 2 days after I got home, still walking stiff from the surgery, a folded letter appeared in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just a single sheet typed in bolded font with the HOA logo at the top. It accused me of disrupting community order by spreading defamatory content and failing to comply with neighborhood decorum. No signature. Just Maple Hollow HOA board. I read it twice, then laughed. It wasn't even properly formatted. No legal language. No citations. Just a tantrum dressed in Times New Roman. I walked next door to Frank's house. He was out back replacing a fence panel, his dog snoozing in the shade. "She's trying to intimidate me now. Look." Frank took the letter, squinted at it, then handed it back. "She's bluffing. That's not even an official violation. No letterhead footer, no certified delivery. Just noise. Noise can still get loud," I said. "That's why we're turning up the volume on our end." He pulled out a clipboard from the patio table. The petition had 42 signatures already. He pointed to the bottom. "If we hit 50, we can trigger a special homeowners vote. Full board re-election." I signed without hesitation. Later that night, I started combing through the Maple Hollow HOA's public financial disclosures. Every HOA is required to file quarterly expense reports and annual budgets, and thankfully, those documents were accessible through the county clerk's portal. Took me less than an hour to spot the irregularities. There were multiple reimbursements listed under Community Services Enforcement. Thousands of dollars were being funneled into a vague line item that had no breakdown or receipts. It got worse. There were payouts marked legal consultation, all issued to a company called Applegate Municipal Advisors, LLC. I looked it up. It wasn't a law firm. It was a shell company, registered to a P.O. box in another county. Owner, Sandra Applegate. She had been paying herself with HOA funds. I printed everything, highlighted each transaction, and called someone I knew from my time at the hospital, a man named Curtis Barlow. He was a compliance officer at the Regional Health Board, but before that he'd worked as a forensic accountant for the city's audit division. We met at a diner off Route 17. Curtis wore a faded bomber jacket and had a habit of tapping his pen against his knuckle when he was thinking. He flipped through the printouts, his eyebrows rising higher with each page. "She's embezzling from her own neighborhood," he said. "That's fraud, plain and simple. Can we prove it?" I asked. Curtis nodded. "If this company's just a shell to cash out HOA funds, yeah. Especially if she used HOA authority to approve the payouts without a vote." "She did," I said. "No one I've talked to remembers any mention of it." He leaned back. Then you've got enough to file a formal complaint with the state HOA regulatory board. There's a fraud investigation division. I'll help you draft it. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I took the data Curtis flagged, compiled it into a clean report, and mailed it certified to the state's Department of Community Affairs, complete with timelines, scanned documents, and a witness list. I included the ambulance footage too, not because it directly tied into the fraud, but because it showed the kind of person we were dealing with. 3 days later, the state opened an investigation. Sandra still had no idea how deep the hole she was standing in had become, but she was about to find out. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon in the community clubhouse. I showed up early, notepad in hand, and took a seat in the front row. Frank was already there, along with 30-something residents. Sandra walked in 10 minutes late wearing a cherry red pantsuit and sunglasses. She carried a folder under one arm and looked like she'd just walked off a daytime talk show set. "Let's begin," she said, ignoring the tension in the air. A man from the back stood up before she could continue. His name was Malik, a retired military logistics officer who'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone. "You don't get to run this meeting today," he said calmly. Sandra blinked. "Excuse me. You've been suspended. Majority vote. We have the petition right here." He held up the clipboard. The room clapped. Sandra's face froze. "This is procedural misconduct. You can't just, you violated Article 5, Section 12, Malik interrupted. Any board member under active investigation by a state regulatory body is automatically removed from fiduciary duties until the matter is resolved." That shut her up, because she didn't know yet, but by then she'd already received the state's audit notice. Curtis had sent me a copy of the confirmation. The moment she opened that envelope, her control over HOA finances froze. Frank stepped forward. "We're forming a temporary oversight committee. 2 from each cul-de-sac. We'll handle community maintenance while the audit is active." Sandra's voice was shrill now. "This is a witch hunt." "No," I said, standing. "This is accountability." The meeting ended with Sandra storming out. People followed her to the parking lot, not to support her, but to make sure she didn't take anything from the clubhouse. That night, I got a call from the city prosecutor's office. "Mr. Runnels, this is ADA Stephanie Granger. We received your documentation via the Department of Community Affairs. We'd like to schedule a meeting." Turns out Sandra's fraud wasn't just a civil matter. Because she'd used falsified vendor names and routed funds through a company she owned, it crossed into criminal territory. Wire fraud, misappropriation of fiduciary funds, falsification of public records, and obstruction of emergency services? That was still on the table too. I met with ADA Granger the next day. She was sharp and methodical, the kind of person who could dismantle a defense lawyer with 3 sentences and a binder. "People like this," she said, pointing to Sandra's name on the printed case file, "they get away with it because no one wants to deal with the paperwork. But you did, and you kept receipts. Is there any chance she walks?" I asked. Granger shook her head. "Not if we've got documentation of financial fraud and obstruction of emergency personnel. That Lexus stunt? That's going to haunt her in court." By the end of the week, Maple Hollow's Temporary Oversight Committee had scheduled a community meeting. This time, it wasn't about policies or fences. It was to vote on a full HOA restructuring. We weren't just removing Sandra. We were tearing down the system she built. And rebuilding it into something that served the residents, not controlled them. The morning Sandra was arrested, it was raining. A thin, steady drizzle that dampened the sidewalks and made the whole neighborhood feel hushed, like it was holding its breath. I was on my porch, coffee in hand, watching a pair of crows squabble over something in the gutter when 2 unmarked sedans rolled into Maple Hollow. They pulled up in front of Sandra's house like they'd done it 100 times before. I didn't see the agents exit the cars, but I did hear the knock. Not polite, not a request. The kind of knock that wasn't waiting for an answer. Sandra didn't come out right away. The porch light flicked on, then off again. A shadow shifted behind the curtains. Then the door opened just wide enough for one of the agents to step inside. She emerged 3 minutes later, hands cuffed in front of her, wearing a robe with a print that looked like someone had spilled raspberry jam on cotton candy. Her mouth moved, but the rain muffled whatever excuse she was trying to manufacture. The agents said nothing. They walked her down the steps, guided her into the back seat of the second sedan, and drove off without fanfare. I didn't cheer. No one did. But neighbors watched from windows. A few porch lights turned on. Someone across the street lowered a flag to half-mast. Not for Sandra, but for the community we'd all let her poison for too long. 3 hours later, the charges were public. Mail fraud, wire fraud, obstruction of critical medical services, misuse of public trust, and the one that made everyone blink twice, evidence tampering. That last one came from a discovery made by the state auditors. While combing through HOA email archives, they uncovered that Sandra had deleted digital records of board meetings, vote tallies, and finance logs. She'd even tried to backdate minutes to cover unauthorized withdrawals. She thought no one would notice. She was wrong. I got the full breakdown from ADA Granger when I met her at the municipal building later that week. She looked more energized than I'd ever seen her. Her case pile probably hadn't given her something this clean in months. She was deleting emails from the HOA's Google Workspace, Granger said, flipping through a folder. What she didn't count on was the state subpoenaing the back end from the service provider. She thought she could just erase the trail, I said. She made it easier to follow. We've got timestamps, IP logs, even drafts. I leaned forward. What about the people who approved those payments? Did anyone else sign off? Granger shook her head. That's where it gets interesting. She forged board member approvals. Fake digital signatures. Used old scanned forms and pasted in names. Forgery. On top of everything else. I let out a quiet breath. She's not walking away from this, is she? Not unless she's walking to a cell. Despite everything, part of me was still stunned. I'd known Sandra was petty, self-important, dangerous even. But this? It was like peeling back drywall and finding a nest of wires sizzling behind the panel. Maple Hollow wasn't just mismanaged. It had been stolen. The Temporary Oversight Committee held a town hall a week after the arrest. They booked the public high school auditorium this time to fit the crowd. Over 100 residents showed up, filling the seats and lining the back wall. Malik stood at the podium, calm but firm. First order of business, he said. We're dissolving the existing HOA charter. Effective immediately. Someone clapped. Then another. Within seconds, the room erupted into applause. Not polite approval relief, like a fever had finally broken. And second, Malik continued once it settled. We're forming a transitional board, new bylaws, new elections, term limits, financial transparency. No more backroom decisions. A younger woman near the front raised her hand. What about the fines Sandra issued? The ones people paid. We're auditing everything, Malik said. If you paid a fine tied to false violations, you'll be reimbursed. If Sandra used that money for personal gain, it'll be part of the restitution case. A man near the back spoke up. What about the security cameras she installed at the clubhouse? Are those still recording? That got murmurs. I hadn't even known about that. They were, Malik said. But not anymore. We pulled the hard drives. Turns out they were also wired to her personal server. She was monitoring meetings. Even flagged certain residents by name. That silenced the room. Granger had mentioned surveillance violations, but I hadn't realized it included residents. She was tracking people, someone asked. Only those she considered disruptive, Malik replied. Which included the Petrovskis, who painted their shutters blue, and Marcus Tang, who mowed his lawn diagonally. The absurdity of it would have been funny if it weren't so infuriating. After the meeting, I stepped outside and found Frank leaning against a lamppost, arms crossed. She had a whole system, he said. Layers of it. That surveillance thing? She used it to time her inspections. That's how she always caught people. I nodded. She thought she was building a kingdom. Frank glanced at the auditorium behind us. And now it's dust. There was still work to do. The finances had to be untangled. The new board needed to be formed. But the atmosphere had shifted. People weren't scared anymore. They were angry, yes, but also hopeful. Determined. The next few weeks moved quickly. The state assigned a financial monitor to oversee the HOA's transition. Curtis volunteered as liaison and helped set up a secure digital ledger for all future transactions. Every dollar spent would be trackable. Public. Granger filed for a court order to seize Sandra's personal accounts. They froze her assets within 72 hours. Turns out she'd been funneling money into a shared fund with her sister in another state. The DA's office was now looking into whether she had help. Community volunteers took over landscaping and maintenance. The clubhouse was reopened to residents. The surveillance cameras were dismantled and sold for parts. The money went into a communal emergency fund. And as for Sandra, she was denied bail. Too many risks. Flight, evidence destruction, retaliation. Her arraignment was scheduled for the following month. I didn't attend the first hearing, but I read the court summary. She pleaded not guilty. Her attorney argued that the ambulance obstruction was a misunderstanding, that the financial records were incomplete, and that the digital forgeries were clerical errors. The judge didn't buy it. Her trial was set for early fall. Granger was building a case that would make it impossible for Sandra to weasel out. She had witnesses, documents, metadata, and a mountain of evidence showing deliberate intent. One night, as I sat on my porch watching the streetlights flicker on, Frank walked over with 2 beers. He handed me one, then sat on the steps. "You know what the best part of this is?" he asked. "What?" "She's not coming back. Even if she beats some of the charges, she's finished here. No one wants her. No one trusts her." I nodded. "We finally got our neighborhood back." He took a sip and looked down the street. "You think other HOAs are watching this? They should be. Because this wasn't just about one corrupt woman with a clipboard and a god complex. It was about the systems that let her operate unchecked. The bylaws that gave her power with no oversight. The apathy that let her grow roots in every part of the community. But not anymore. We'd pulled those roots out, one by one, and in their place we were planting something stronger. Smarter. Fair. A neighborhood where people helped each other instead of spying through blinds. Where rules made sense and were decided together. Where no one, not even a self-declared queen in a cherry red pantsuit, could block an ambulance and call it authority. Sandra tried to build an empire on fear. We tore it down with facts. And now we were building something better. The day the trial began, the courthouse steps buzzed with quiet tension. Not media, not protests. Just local residents, a few city officials, and a growing sense that we were walking into the final chapter of something long overdue. The hearing room wasn't packed, but the air felt dense. Like the walls themselves were waiting to see how much rot had to be scraped away. Sandra entered flanked by 2 attorneys. Her hair was pinned up tight, her expression flat. Gone was the neon wardrobe, replaced by a gray skirt suit that looked borrowed. She didn't glance at anyone in the gallery. She was trying to look composed, but her hands, clutched too tightly in her lap, told the truth. The judge was a direct woman in her 60s with a reputation for cutting through grandstanding. She opened with a warning: any disruptions or outbursts would result in immediate removal. No one needed the reminder. We weren't here for drama. We were here for reckoning. Assistant District Attorney Granger led the prosecution. She brought documents, digital logs, subpoenaed bank statements, server backups, and witness lists. She didn't pace. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid the evidence out one tile at a time until it formed a picture that couldn't be misunderstood. Sandra had filed 27 fraudulent reimbursement claims over 3 years. She had created a fake consulting firm, rerouted HOA maintenance budgets into it, and falsified signatures from former board members, some of whom had moved away years ago. She'd even submitted payment approvals under the name of a homeowner who'd been deceased since 2019. There was a moment about halfway through the first day when the courtroom fell completely still. Granger had just displayed a slide showing the internal email where Sandra instructed the HOA treasurer, a man named Will Dobbins, to get creative with the numbers until she could shift the heat off the enforcement fund. Dobbins had flipped on her 2 weeks earlier. He sat in the witness box, pale and sweating, but clear. He admitted his role. He admitted he'd stayed quiet because Sandra threatened to have his mortgage flagged for non-compliance if he stepped out of line. What broke him, he said, was the ambulance. When he saw the footage, her standing in the road shouting at first responders, he realized who he'd been working for. "I thought she was just tough," he said. "I didn't realize she was dangerous." The defense tried to paint Sandra as overwhelmed, burdened by responsibility, unsupported by a lazy board. They argued that the payments were misfiled, not stolen, that the signatures were reconstructions, that the ambulance incident was a misinterpreted moment during a routine inspection. But then Granger played the full audio from the ambulance dashcam. The part that hadn't circulated online. "You're not supposed to be here without HOA clearance," Sandra said on tape. "People abuse the system all the time. I'm not moving until someone shows me proper documentation." The EMT had replied, "Ma'am, he's in cardiac distress. Move your vehicle." Sandra had said, "That's not my problem. He shouldn't have blocked the sidewalk yesterday." You could hear the paramedics' breath catch. Then the static of dispatch confirming a delay reroute. No one said anything for almost a full minute after the recording ended. The judge finally leaned forward. "Is that your voice, Ms. Applegate?" Sandra's attorney tried to object. The judge overruled it. Sandra didn't answer. Granger didn't need her to. By the third day, the trial had shifted from proving wrongdoing to quantifying it. The fraud totaled over $74,000. The obstruction charge carried its own weight, but what really sealed Sandra's fate was the tampering. She had installed unauthorized surveillance in the clubhouse, in violation of both municipal privacy ordinances and the HOA's own charter. She had manually edited digital minutes to erase objections from board members who challenged her. She had even attempted to wipe the server during the audit, but the IT contractor she hired had quietly cloned the drive before wiping it, as required by contract. He testified too, and he brought the logs. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. They found her guilty on all counts. Sentencing was scheduled for the following week. The judge didn't wait to revoke her bail. Sandra was remanded into custody and escorted out through the side door, her mouth tight and her eyes fixed straight ahead. No one applauded. This wasn't a celebration. It was the final nail in a coffin she built herself. One forged from ego and control and the belief that rules didn't apply to her. At sentencing, Granger read a statement from the hospital. The delay caused by Sandra's interference had forced the ambulance to route through a construction detour, costing 7 critical minutes. While I had survived, their report noted that another patient in a similar situation could have died. The judge sentenced Sandra to 8 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 5. She was fined a total of $123,000 in restitution to be paid into a newly formed community fund for HOA reform and emergency infrastructure. She was also permanently banned from holding any position in a homeowners association, nonprofit board, or community enforcement agency. After the sentencing, the neighborhood shifted in ways I didn't expect. The new HOA system rebuilt from scratch was rebranded as the Maple Hollow Neighborhood Collaborative. It wasn't mandatory. It didn't dictate lawn length or fence colors. It focused on shared resources, snow removal, pest control, seasonal events. No fines. No surprise inspections. Participation was voluntary and every budget item was voted on publicly. We installed a new emergency access gate funded by the restitution. It opened onto a direct road to the hospital, secure but accessible to first responders. The city worked with us to update the zoning, ensuring no single person could ever control traffic flow again. I returned to work at the hospital 2 weeks after the final hearing. My supervisor, a straight-talking trauma nurse named Colleen, greeted me with a nod. She didn't say much. She just handed me a fresh ID badge and said, "Heard you took down a HOA with paperwork. That's a new one." I smiled. "I've had practice with stubborn people. Next time just call off for the heart attack, all right?" I settled back into routine, but something stayed different. I started getting calls from other neighborhoods, other cities. People asking how we'd done it, what laws we'd used, who to contact. I wrote up a guide. Curtis helped. Granger reviewed it. We called it the Community Oversight Toolkit. We distributed it online for free. Within 2 months, it had been downloaded over 4,000 times. The last time I saw Sandra was from a distance during a transport hearing. She didn't look at anyone. She wore county orange, hands shackled, chin down. I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't feel vengeful either. Just resolved. She could spend the next 8 years thinking about fences and sidewalks and fines. I'd spend mine helping people tear down the walls that tyrants like her tried to build. We had turned the HOA into a punchline. But more importantly, we turned the neighborhood into a community again. And nothing, not threats, not fines, not even a Lexus parked sideways was ever going to change that.